Good afternoon and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Anya Bershad will present emerging treatments for social disconnection in psychiatric illness. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of over 190 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that the research funded by BBRF has had such a great impact is because we do not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the foundation has awarded over $460 million to fund more than 6,500 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Anya Bershad. Dr. Bershad is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA. She was a 2022 Young Investigator. Our webinar will begin with her presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the question tab on the control screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as allotted in the time that we have. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Bershad. Anya, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff, for the introduction. Can everybody see my screen? It looks like it's
yes.
Good shape. All right. So I'm really excited to be here today to tell you about some of the work we've been doing with the support of the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. And this is work that we're very invested in and very excited about. And I'm looking forward to this opportunity to share some of it with you. All right. Oh.
If you can just click on the slide. Yep.
Okay. There we go. All right. So I want to start by telling you the story of a patient who I met during residency. This was a woman in her 50s who had been living with a diagnosis of schizophrenia for decades. And when I asked her about the history of her illness and how she had been managing some of her symptoms, she said to me, "I made an important discovery several years ago. The voices get quiet during my book club." And she explained that years ago she had begun attending a book club as a sort of distraction, but she soon became close with the other members of the group, and she realized that this weekly book club was a couple of hours during which the voices she had gotten so used to hearing would quiet down. And to her, this routine social activity was absolutely essential in managing her illness. And so today I want to tell you about work that we and others have been doing to help patients experience this feeling of social connection and to take advantage of all the benefits that come from it. So this is a brief overview of what I'll discuss today. First, I want to tell you about the health consequences of social disconnection. Then I'll talk about how many different diagnoses across the spectrum of psychiatric illness can have social symptoms that make it more difficult for individuals to develop and maintain social connections. And then I'll share this novel approach we call social psychopharmacology, where we're testing a number of different medications in the treatment of social symptoms. And I'll share 2 examples with you. And then finally, I'll wrap up with take-home points and future directions for this research. So unfortunately, social connection can be hard to come by for many in our community. Many of us feel lonely and socially isolated, and this is from the CDC website. 1/3 of adults in the United States feel lonely, and 1/4 report a lack of social and emotional support. This number climbs to over 50% for adults ages 50 through 80. So these are very striking numbers, and for individuals with psychiatric illness, the numbers are even higher. An accumulating body of evidence suggests that there are several health effects of loneliness and social disconnection. In addition to increasing the risk of cardiovascular problems like high blood pressure and strokes by about 30%, social disconnection leads to a weakened immune system and earlier death overall. Social disconnection also leads to an increase in depression and anxiety, greater rates of suicide, substance abuse, and cognitive symptoms like memory problems. And in 2023, the US Surgeon General issued an advisory statement on our epidemic of loneliness. A recent study reported prolonged social isolation can have negative health effects equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it's a pretty substantial problem that we're dealing with. Individuals with psychiatric illness suffer from increased risk of social disconnection beyond that of the general population. And this is for a number of reasons. But one reason is that many psychiatric illnesses spanning the DSM impact social function. So individuals with autism can have difficulty detecting social cues. Personality disorders can affect the way individuals connect with others and their ability to form and maintain social connections. Mood disorders can also impact social function and the way people respond to positive and negative social input. And in psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, there can be problems with social cognition, recognizing social cues and social motivation. So when we talk about social symptoms, we talk about changes related to both blunted responses to pleasurable social activities on the one hand, and also heightened responses to potential negative social experiences. So in terms of reduced social pleasure, we talk about social anhedonia, which is a symptom of several psychiatric disorders, which is a lack of social pleasure. And we talk about a symptom called asociality, which is a symptom of schizophrenia. It's reduced or absent social motivation. Social cognitive problems, as I mentioned before, can lead to reduced perception of positive social cues. And then symptoms like social anxiety and paranoia down here are characteristic heightened negative responses to kind of negative or threatening social input. So despite how debilitating these symptoms can be for patients and how widespread they are, there are currently no pharmacologic treatments for social symptoms. The medications we use to treat psychiatric diagnoses don't target these symptoms. And while we do have psychosocial interventions, the social symptoms themselves sometimes can limit patient participation in these programs. So my field is in social psychopharmacology, and that means identifying medications that may target some of these symptoms in patients. And we want to ask the question, how can we use drugs or medications to improve social function? The first step in treating this problem is measuring it. So even though social symptoms are pervasive across the spectrum of psychiatric illness, there's still no consensus on how to measure them. One way is through clinical interviews with trained interviewers, where a clinician sits down with a patient and completes a rating scale. But the problem is that few symptom rating instruments actually capture the full range of social symptoms that patients experience. So another way is by asking patients to fill out questionnaires about their own social function. But as you can imagine, sometimes there are discrepancies between what people report and their actual real-world social function. So next we have behavioral measures. And I'm going to talk a bit more about these types of measures in this talk. So we can, for example, use eye tracking to measure social attention, And we can also use what we call performance-based measures. An example of these is an effort-based paradigm to measure how much effort individuals are willing to exert for social rewards, or an emotion identification task to assess how well individuals are able to recognize emotion in the faces of others. These tests have the advantage of being more objective than self-report measures. And then finally, we have brain-based measures where we can use neuroimaging techniques to measure how the brain responds to social input. So examples of these are functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and electroencephalography, EEG. All these measures have advantages and disadvantages, and I'll show you data using some of them later in the talk. So which compounds may actually be helpful for social symptoms? One of the early treatments that showed promise for these symptoms was the social bonding hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin is a neuropeptide hormone involved in social behavior that received a lot of attention over the past 20 years or so. And it acts both on the brain and also on female reproductive organs during labor and lactation. And this very cute picture is of a pair of prairie voles. And prairie voles mate for life. And so oxytocin was initially studied in the formation of these prairie vole pair bonds. And in psychiatric research in humans, oxytocin has been shown to improve some dimensions of social perception. So one thing that came out of these early findings was that oxytocin is now being marketed online as liquid trust. So this is an oxytocin nasal spray that you can buy online. It's called For Love. So before you go out and buy this oxytocin, I want to tell you about several clinical trials that we followed up these initial studies that may affect your decision to purchase this. So this is a study that showed improvement in social responsiveness in autism with 4 weeks of oxytocin nasal spray. And unfortunately, subsequent trials like this one in the New England Journal of Medicine, in addition to several others using oxytocin in the treatment of PTSD, schizophrenia, and mood disorders, have had more mixed results. So ultimately, evidence in support of oxytocin as a treatment for social symptoms didn't live up to this early promise that the compound showed. So why is that? The mixed findings with oxytocin were a big disappointment in the field. There's still some oxytocin research going on, but there are a few reasons that it's difficult to use this compound to treat social symptoms. One is that oxytocin doesn't get into the brain well if taken orally, so it must be administered in this nasal spray, which is kind of cumbersome. And it makes it difficult to tell how much oxytocin is actually reaching the brain. Also, the effects of oxytocin are highly dependent on social context. It turns out that in some contexts, oxytocin can facilitate trust, but in others, it may actually increase aggression. So it's difficult to work with a medication that can have such different effects depending on the context. And finally, there are individual factors that may influence how effective oxytocin is, including baseline personality, sex and sex hormone levels, and menstrual cycle phase. So if the social bonding hormone oxytocin isn't a solution to this problem, where can we look next? This is an image from a 19th century Turkish coffee house. We know that certain so-called psychoactive drugs, or drugs that produce a particular subjective experience, are used in social context and can facilitate social interactions. So one person who tried the compound MDMA said, "I felt like hugging everyone. Hugging was the most rewarding, comforting, and uplifting experience." One question we want to ask is, can we safely leverage these pro-social effects in a therapeutic context? And lately, the line between recreational drugs, so-called recreational drugs, and therapeutic drugs have been blurred lately, as some compounds previously viewed as recreational are showing significant therapeutic effects in psychiatry. So I'm going to tell you about 2 examples today, the opioid buprenorphine and the amphetamine derivative MDMA. Before talking about buprenorphine, I want to give a brief overview of the opioid system in the brain. So opioids are neurotransmitters that come in different varieties in the brain, and there are 4 types of receptors for them: mu, delta, kappa, and nociceptin receptors. And I have this image up here to show that opioid receptors are widely distributed throughout the brain, especially in what we call limbic regions, or regions involved in emotion processing. And classically, the opioid system is involved in responding to painful stimuli, which is why analgesic medications like morphine often target this system. But more recently, the opioid system has been shown to be essential in mediating social behavior. So in the 1970s, the psychologist Jaak Panksepp developed this theory for the role of opioids in mediating social behavior that he called the brain opioid theory of social attachment. He actually became well known for studying whether rats can laugh, which I find a really sort of sweet story. And he's up here with his rat mask. But what I want to talk about is his contribution to understanding opioids and social behavior. The receptors in both the mu opioid system and the kappa opioid system are important in social function, although in different ways. So evidence suggests that mu opioid receptor activation, either through natural endorphins or through a drug like morphine, favors positive social feelings. Conversely, for the kappa opioid system, it is deactivation of the receptors that favor positive social feelings. So when the kappa system is activated, it pushes the system more in the direction of negative social feelings, social anxiety and threat responses. So given this information, a drug that both activates the mu opioid system and deactivates the kappa opioid system may have the strongest prosocial effects. And there is one such drug. So this is buprenorphine, a unique opioid drug that exerts both of these effects. This drug is used in opioid substitution therapy at higher doses at 16 to 24 milligrams daily, and has been shown to reduce suicidality at lower doses, 0.2 milligrams. So because of its pharmacologic profile and its actions on both the mu and kappa opioid system, it may act to both increase positive social feelings and decrease negative social feelings. So this is work conducted with Dr. Harriet DeWitt at the University of Chicago. And I want to tell you a little bit about how we conduct our trials in general before getting into this study with buprenorphine. So we use a controlled laboratory setting, and we run the sessions in a room that looks like this. So it's comfortable enough for participants to relax during the drug effects. It has been shown that the environment in which psychoactive drugs are administered can affect participants' experience of the drug effects themselves. So we really make an effort to make this space comfortable with comfortable lighting, comfortable chairs. And all of our participants undergo a medical and psychiatric screen before participating. They're randomly assigned to a group. In this study, we had 3 groups: placebo, a lower dose of buprenorphine, and a higher dose of buprenorphine. And the participants each attended 2 sessions in this study. So we were interested in testing the effects of buprenorphine on responses to social stress. And so our participants attended 1 session where we had a simulated stress task, and then another session where we had a non-stressful control task. This is a session timeline. So we conducted baseline measures of mood, blood pressure, heart rate, and levels of the stress hormone cortisol in the saliva when the participant arrives. And then they are given their tablet, either a placebo or one of the doses of buprenorphine. And then we wait for 90 minutes. And during expected peak drug effect, we administer this stress task. It's called the Trier Social Stress Task, and it's a standardized measure of psychosocial stress. So what we do is we tell our participants that they're going to have to give a 10-minute speech in front of a trained panel of interviewers, and that they'll be recorded during the speech. This is an image of the task here. It's a very stressful. It increases anxiety, heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormone levels in the saliva. And so throughout the rest of the session, we continue to measure vital signs and mood, and then at the end of the day, the participants go home. So here are our results. If we look at subjective ratings of how threatening participants found this stress task, you can see placebo is here in kind of the orangey peachy color, and then buprenorphine at the lower dose is purple and the higher dose is turquoise. Buprenorphine dose dependently reduces this feeling of threat in response to the task. And similarly, if you look at the stress hormone cortisol, so here we have time on the x-axis, and this is salivary cortisol levels on the y-axis. The gray shaded area is where the stress task took place. And you can see in the placebo condition, there is this peak in cortisol following the task. But both doses of buprenorphine flatten this line, so they abolish the cortisol response to stress. We thought these were pretty striking effects. And so beyond responses to stress, we wanted to look at how this drug affected other types of social behavior. One important psychiatric social symptom is heightened rejection sensitivity. So patients may feel so bad about a real or imagined rejection in a social situation that they avoid engaging in further encounters. So in this paradigm called cyberball, it's designed to simulate social rejection. So participants play 2 virtual ball toss games with other players. In the first game, which is shown here, they receive the ball, they're able to throw it back to the other 2 players. They receive the ball about a third of the time. And this is the accept condition. Then they play another game. This is the reject condition. So they receive the ball once or twice at the beginning of this game, and then the other 2 players just throw the ball back and forth amongst themselves, and the participant is excluded from playing further. And after each game, we administer mood questionnaires and ask the participants to what extent they thought they were included in this game. So we administered buprenorphine and then had our participants play these cyberball games. And these are our results. So you can see here that if you look at the reject condition, buprenorphine increases the extent to which participants felt included in this game. And similarly, if you look at self-reported negative mood following rejection, buprenorphine reduces this negative mood after participants are rejected. Okay. So beyond asking participants to self-report on their mood, we can use eye tracking tasks to more objectively measure how they allocate social attention. This is a social attention bias task, and I'll talk about this a couple of times today. It measures social seeking behavior. So it assesses attention to positive and negative social cues. So we show participants 2 faces side by side. It's the same actor depicting an emotion. So one face expresses an emotion like anger is up here, and then the face next to it is a neutral face. And we can measure using electrooculography shown here or eye tracking where participants look on the screen, whether they initially orient to the emotive face or to the neutral face. And when we do this task following buprenorphine, we get this interesting result. So this is the total number of first gazes toward each emotion type: happy, angry, fearful, and sad. And if you look here, you can see that buprenorphine reduces the total number of first gazes toward fearful faces. So it reduces individuals' attention to this negative emotion type. This suggests a reduced response to negative emotional cues. So the previous study I mentioned was conducted in healthy volunteers, but we were interested in the question of whether patients with symptoms of depression and anxiety may be more sensitive to the effects of buprenorphine. So here we administered a scale called the Depression and Anxiety and Stress Scale, or the DAS. And we have DAS scored on the x-axis down here. And you can see that as symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress increase, buprenorphine has a stronger blunting effect on this first gaze to fearful faces. So this suggests that patients with psychiatric symptoms may be even more sensitive to the beneficial social effects of the drug. So Many patients with schizophrenia suffer from social symptoms. And I told you about patients with depression, anxiety, and stress, but I haven't told you about patients with any psychotic illness so far. We're also interested in whether these patients may benefit from low-dose buprenorphine. So I want to introduce you to this very exciting ongoing study in our lab in which we're testing the effects of low-dose buprenorphine to treat social symptoms in patients with schizophrenia who are socially disconnected. So this is a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, and participants each attend 2 sessions, one at which they receive placebo and one at which they receive buprenorphine, and then we compare their behavior across 2 sessions. So this way they act as their own control in our study. In this study, we're including new measures of social synchrony to see how the drug affects a real-world social interaction. So in this study, we have participants engage in a semi-structured conversation with a laboratory confederate, and we can measure how much they synchronize their behavior with another person. So pairs of people who have close relationships naturally synchronize many aspects of their behavior during an interaction, and we can use audiovisual recording to look at how individuals synchronize the expression of emotion on their faces and the pitch of their voices during these encounters. We're also using an exciting new measure of neural synchrony. So we measure neural synchrony using electroencephalography, or EEG, while a pair of participants is engaged in a conversation. And we can measure the relationship between activity in each scalp electrode in relation to the other person. So I've put a sample image on here showing these correlations between EEG electrode pairs between a participant and a laboratory confederate during a placebo session on the top and a buprenorphine session on the bottom. So this type of neural synchrony is increased between people who share close interpersonal relationships. And we're testing whether buprenorphine can facilitate this type of synchrony. And this work is in collaboration with Eric Rivas at UCLA. I want to return to this figure I showed earlier briefly, depicting how social symptoms may relate to both heightened responses to negative social input and reduced responses to positive social input. So I spent some time speaking about how buprenorphine may reduce some of these negative social feelings. And now I want to move on to talk about a drug that may enhance positive social feelings, MDMA. So 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, or MDMA, is an amphetamine derivative that in many ways produces typical amphetamine effects. So it increases alertness, euphoria, it increases heart rate and blood pressure. And these effects are thought to be related to MDMA's action on the dopamine and norepinephrine systems. If you look at this chemical structure of MDMA, which I put up here, it looks very similar to methamphetamine at the top, but it has this additional ring, and this ring leads to some additional effects. So MDMA is used recreationally in social settings, and it causes people to feel closer with others, more open and more empathic. It interacts with the serotonin transporter, and it facilitates the release of serotonin, inducing the release of oxytocin, which may sound familiar, that I mentioned before. And it's thought that these additional effects lead to the special so-called empathogenic effects of the drug, or its effects on social closeness. And MDMA has shown promise in a number of recent clinical trials recently as an adjunct to psychotherapy in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. But these trials haven't specifically addressed the effects of the drug on social symptoms or social behavior. If you give MDMA to rats, they lie close together like this. This behavior is called adjacent lying. And you can see here with increasing doses of MDMA, they spend more and more time lying next to one another. And that's depicted in this graph down here. When humans take MDMA, they do a very similar thing. So this is a cuddle puddle. And we have shown, oops, gonna go back. We have shown in the laboratory that MDMA increases the pleasantness of social touch. So these bars depict placebo, 2 doses of MDMA, and then methamphetamine active comparator. And you can see the high dose of MDMA increases pleasantness ratings of social touch. So we've objectively shown that MDMA has this effect. And more generally, MDMA increases desire to socialize. So when participants are asked how they would prefer to spend the next 10 minutes after receiving MDMA, their preference for a social activity increases. That's seen here. This isn't true for time spent alone or time spent solving word problems. So now I want to return for a moment to the attention bias task that I showed you earlier with buprenorphine. So if you recall, buprenorphine reduces attention to fearful faces. Here we tested 2 doses of MDMA and a dose of methamphetamine as an active comparator. And you can see that the high dose of MDMA increases attention to happy faces. So this suggests that MDMA may boost responses to social reward and potentially target the domain of social symptoms related to social anhedonia and asociality, or blunted responses to social reward. So while smiling faces are nice to see, we can imagine there are more rewarding types of social information to test. And one of these is positive social feedback. So one of our collaborators, David Shu, developed this task to provide positive and negative social feedback in a laboratory setting. And in this task, subjects first rate profiles of other people by answering the question, would I like this person? We then choose the top 10% of profiles. And this is to increase the salience of feedback from these people. So if you get positive feedback from somebody that you said you like, it's potentially more pleasurable and more impactful than if you get positive feedback from somebody that you didn't like. So we choose the top 10% of these profiles. And then during peak drug effect, the subjects are shown a picture of themselves next to a picture of the other person and given feedback in 3 conditions. Acceptance, indicating that the other person liked them. Neutral, indicating that the other person gave no response. Or rejection, indicating that the other person did not like them. And then they fill out mood questionnaires after each block, indicating how the social feedback made them feel. So in this study, we had 2 doses of MDMA and a methamphetamine comparator again. And you can see in the acceptance conditions, where subjects were told that the other person would definitely like them, MDMA enhances positive mood responses. So the drug makes this type of social reward even more rewarding. And then if you look at the other 2 conditions, the neutral and reject condition, we don't see the same effect. So that type of social feedback is one way to model social behavior, but it's not a real world social encounter. And the effects of a drug like MDMA may be different when 2 people are interacting face to face in a more real world encounter, like during a conversation. So in this task, during expected peak drug effect, participants were asked to engage in 45 minutes of semi-structured conversation with a laboratory confederate. The participants were given a list of questions to use during this conversation. That's what semi-structured means. So the questions weren't overly personal. They were like, how did you spend Halloween? And then they subsequently filled out a questionnaire assessing how close they felt with their conversation partner. And these are the results from this paradigm. Red is placebo and blue is 100 milligrams of MDMA. And the left shows ratings of meaningfulness of the conversation with a laboratory confederate. And the right shows ratings of closeness with the conversation partner. So these were results published by Hannah Malla and Harriet DeWitt at University of Chicago, showing that MDMA increases ratings of both dimensions, facilitating feelings of social connection. And this could be one way in which MDMA facilitates psychotherapy in the treatment of PTSD. Low social motivation is a debilitating symptom of schizophrenia. And as I mentioned earlier, there are no pharmacologic treatments for this symptom. The effects of psychosocial interventions like social skills training are limited by low social motivation. So it's imperative that we identify treatments that can boost social motivation to potentially increase engagement in these psychosocial treatments and make them more effective. In schizophrenia, there may be a discrepancy between how much individuals say they would like to socialize and how much effort they're actually able to invest in social processes. So here, I want to introduce a novel behavioral task that we're developing in collaboration with Eric Rivas, called the social effort-based task. So in this task, we are assessing how much effort participants are willing to exert to engage with a social versus a non-social reward. So in this task, participants choose between unlocking a social or a non-social image. That's an image with or without people depicted. And each choice is associated with a number of button clicks that it's necessary to unlock the image. And this varies on each trial. So you can see this is 25 clicks to see the non-social image, 38 clicks to see the social image. So they see little cue markers here, and then they select which option they'd like, and they do the number of clicks, and then they see the social image here. This number of clicks varies on each trial, and so we can use this task to calculate the average number of clicks at which the participant considers it an even trade to see the social and the non-social stimulus. And we consider this to be the cost of the social stimulus. So the higher this number, the more effort somebody is willing to exert to see a social versus a non-social image. When we test the effects of MDMA on this task, these are the results. So here the red bar is placebo and the blue bar is MDMA. This is relative effort exerted for a social reward, and MDMA increases this effort. So MDMA may be helpful to patients by boosting social motivation and enhancing engagement with psychosocial interventions designed to target social symptoms. So this is an important treatment model that I want to take a moment to talk about. MDMA is not a medication that we would prescribe daily, but rather it would be administered a set number of times under the supervision of a clinician in combination with psychosocial support or another psychosocial intervention to potentially enhance the effectiveness of that intervention. And we are currently launching the first trial of MDMA in patients with schizophrenia now. Since MDMA has never been tested in schizophrenia before, this is a safety and tolerability study. I want to say a quick word about the possible mechanisms of MDMA's special prosocial effects. I mentioned that MDMA causes the release of the social bonding hormone oxytocin. So this study looked at blood oxytocin levels after 2 doses of MDMA. So here time is on the x-axis, and this line with the big peak is plasma oxytocin levels after a high dose of MDMA. In this study, they also used intranasal oxytocin, so nasal spray with oxytocin in it, and then measured blood levels of oxytocin. So the first graph is blood levels of oxytocin after MDMA. These second 2 graphs are blood levels of oxytocin after an oxytocin nasal spray at 2 different doses. And you can see MDMA produces an increase in plasma oxytocin that is double that of intranasal oxytocin, and the effect lasts almost 3 times as long. So MDMA may be a more effective way to leverage the oxytocin system in the treatment of psychiatric disorders, and it may be a way to take advantage of some of the beneficial effects of oxytocin that we saw in early studies. So to summarize what I've gone over so far, buprenorphine may be helpful in reducing responses to social stress and social rejection, and generally buffering reactivity to negative social input. MDMA, on the other hand, may be helpful in boosting positive social feelings like motivation to socialize, positive mood in response to social feedback, interpersonal connection, and willingness to exert effort for a social reward. And all these actions may make these compounds promising candidates to facilitate psychosocial interventions that are aimed at treating social symptoms of psychiatric illness. So I've spent the last half hour or so telling you how we may be able to leverage the effects of some psychoactive drugs in the treatment of psychiatric symptoms. But there are obviously important considerations when using these drugs in clinical trials that I have not yet addressed and I think warrant some time. So psychoactive drugs are, by definition, drugs that produce a particular subjective experience. I said psychoactive drugs are psychoactive. And this may be fundamental to the effectiveness of the drugs themselves. We still don't know about that question. So I have up here a graph over time of ratings of I feel high. And the top graph is buprenorphine, 0.2 milligrams, which many of the studies I presented to you use that dose. And the bottom is 2 doses of MDMA, same subjective ratings of I feel high. And you can see that MDMA produces a much stronger effect on this rating of I feel high than buprenorphine. So feeling the drug effect is more a problem for some drugs and at some doses than others. But for MDMA, this means that very often people who are in these placebo-controlled trials, they know when they've taken the drug and when they've taken placebo. So anyone who takes a pill with the expectation that the pill will help, that expectation alone leads to some improvement. This is the purpose of a placebo. It's to show that a drug has beneficial effect beyond the beneficial effect of that expectation itself. And this is essential in clinical trials. So if someone in a placebo-controlled trial realizes that they've received the drug, this could mean that they're unblinded and that any improvement they show, it's impossible to distinguish whether that improvement is due to their expectation of improvement or to the drug itself. And in designing clinical trials, this is a significant issue that we need to consider. So one big question that we need to ask in this type of research is how to maintain the blind. So how we keep people in these clinical trials from knowing whether they got the drug or placebo in order for us to really understand how the drug helps these symptoms. I showed you some trials with MDMA and methamphetamine today, using one strategy to maintain the blind, which is using an active comparator drug. So by including another drug with psychoactive effects, it may be possible to maintain the blind in these studies. Another strategy is to assess blinding efficacy. So at the end of these studies, it's important to ask our participants, what do you think you received? Which drug do you think you received? And how confident are you in receiving that drug? And then it's possible to do an analysis of only the participants who didn't know which drug they received and compare that to the other group, the unblinded group. And these are all very important steps in designing these clinical trials to really test the effectiveness of these drugs. And then this increase in ratings of feel high also needs to be addressed from a clinical safety perspective, and that leads me to my next slide. All drugs have side effects, and a risk-benefit analysis is necessary when considering any potential medication. In the case of MDMA, there are short-term, relatively mild side effects that may occur, like jaw clenching, restlessness, anxiety. And then there are more severe side effects, like cardiovascular problems. With a drug like MDMA that can cause euphoria, we also need to be aware of the abuse potential of the drug. So in larger phase 3 clinical trials of MDMA-assisted therapy in the treatment of PTSD, information was collected on some, but not all of these side effects, and more research is needed to accurately determine the risks for this type of intervention. When we think about ways to minimize the risk of these medications when used in clinical setting, it's important to find the lowest effective dose. and to administer these drugs in a time-limited way in combination with psychosocial interventions. And I want to take a moment to emphasize that these drugs may be beneficial in treating social symptoms, but they do not stand in for social contact. So rather, we hope that these medications facilitate social contact. And the treatment model that we're envisioning is one in which medications don't act alone, but instead enhance the efficacy of a psychosocial treatment designed to build social skills and to provide social support. So this is a very new area of research, and because of this, there are many unknowns. I showed you data from healthy volunteers, but we're just beginning to test these effects of these prosocial compounds in patients with psychiatric symptoms. And as I mentioned, these and other psychiatric drugs have risks. Also, I didn't discuss this very much, but many of the drugs that I have discussed have effects that depend on the setting in which they're administered. So it's very important for all these studies to take into account setting in experimental design. I've mentioned a time-limited treatment model a couple of times, but we really don't know how long the effects may last after a single administration or a handful of administrations of these drugs, nor do we have enough evidence to know the lowest effective doses. And another big question in the field is which psychosocial interventions should be used with which compounds. So many trials of MDMA and the treatment of PTSD, for instance, have all used the compound together with a very specific type of psychotherapy. But we don't know which type of therapy may work best with MDMA or any other compound, and this hasn't been tested. So it could be that supportive psychotherapy, social cognitive training, motivational interviewing, or another modality is most effective with any particular compound, but this hasn't been tested yet. So as you can see, there's many open questions in this area. So to summarize, today I told you about the pervasive problem of social disconnection and how this problem disproportionately affects those suffering from psychiatric illness. Social symptoms may contribute to disconnection, and despite the prevalence and impact of this problem, there are no pharmacologic treatments available for social symptoms in psychiatric illness. Some psychoactive drugs may show promise in this area, and I gave you two examples of buprenorphine and MDMA, but it is imperative to study these drugs in a rigorous way. What does it mean to study these drugs rigorously? First, this means thoroughly measuring and documenting adverse events. This is essential for safety. It also means including proper control conditions to determine which type of psychosocial intervention works best with each compound, and proper blinding to make sure that you're controlling for the placebo effect in these studies and that we have an accurate sense of which improvements are due to the drug effect versus the placebo effect. Finally, we're thinking here of a new treatment model in which these medications would not be taken daily like many psychiatric medications, but rather they would be administered by a clinician as part of a time-limited treatment and combined with psychosocial interventions. So we're really excited about this area of research. We really hope it will lead to better treatments for patients suffering from social isolation and social symptoms. And I hope this presentation gave you a taste of some of the work that we've been doing. And finally, I want to thank some of the many folks involved in this research. So my mentors at University of Chicago, Dr. Harriet DeWitt, and at UCLA, Dr. Steve Martyr and Dr. Michael Green. My colleagues, in addition to laboratory staff who've put in so much work to get these studies done, the NIH, and of course, the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation for funding this very important work. And thank you all for listening. And lastly, if you live in the LA area and you're interested in participating in some of our studies, our study contact is up there. Gerard Devera is our study coordinator. Please get in touch. And thank you, and I appreciate your attention.
Well, Anya, I want to thank you for the work you're doing and for an outstanding presentation. You take these very important clinical issues and scientific issues and explain it in a very user-friendly way. So thank you for that. Let me ask you, as you envision further work in this area, and it is such an important area, where do you see the work going in 5 years from now or 10 years from now?
Yes, thanks for that question. I think this is a really exciting time for this area of research. As I mentioned a couple of times, we don't have any medications that target these symptoms, and so it's ready for this field to take off. My hope is in the next 5 to 10 years, we really get into some clinical trials of medication-assisted psychosocial intervention. So I mentioned a few times using these drugs in combination with psychotherapy or social skills training. I would love to see in the next 5 years a number of clinical trials investigating those combined treatments and the efficacy of those combined treatments in patient populations, because we really have very limited evidence for those treatments, and I think it's so important to do that. So I hope that we and others are able to launch some of those projects in the coming years.
Has there been work done looking at other types of interventions, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, other things that can impact the brain and potentially have an effect on this?
There are very limited. I'm sort of surprised at how little work has focused on this beyond the psychosocial intervention. So there has, and I didn't talk about it today, but there has been a lot of work focused on psychosocial interventions, and some of them are quite effective for facilitating social skills, social cognitive training, those types of interventions. I don't believe that any neuromodulation work has been done in this area beyond some of the psychedelic studies, but there are definitely psychosocial interventions that have been shown to be helpful. But for many patients, if you're struggling with some of these social symptoms, especially avoidance symptoms, what paranoia, social anxiety, it can be really difficult to engage in psychosocial interventions without a little bit of assistance to start out. And then also our patients on the other side with low social motivation, asociality, some of our patients with schizophrenia suffering from negative symptoms, it can be very difficult to really engage in some of these treatments without a little bit of a sort of a boost to help that process.
Is there any advice that you can give to family members, let's say of a loved one who has schizophrenia and is very socially isolated? Is there something that they can do or should do that could help ameliorate that situation? Because that is often so troublesome to the person and then to their family members who see the person being so isolated.
Yes, thank you for that question. That's such an important question, and as a clinician, it's something that we face in the clinic a lot when we see our patients. Often now we see our patients on Zoom, and they've been in their room for all day basically, and we see them on Zoom for their doctor's appointment. And I would say the first thing is understanding why your loved one is socially isolated, whether this is a result of worsened symptoms of paranoia or social anxiety, or is it that they just don't feel they need social contact, they don't want to get out of their room. And those two, low social motivation versus feeling social anxiety, or this what we call avoidance motivation, they're two very different experiences. And the first step in helping somebody with those experiences is kind of understanding which perspective they're coming from, and then we can start to address those symptoms individually. But we tend to lump kind of social withdrawal together, and because they're all types of social withdrawal are not the same, they come from very different social feelings, and it's important to understand the origin of that social withdrawal before stepping in to help.
very important information for families. And I just want to ask you, often we think of interventions occurring when somebody is younger, at the earlier part of their illness. Have you done work to sort of differentiate approaches for somebody, let's say a person in their late teens, early 20s, who are recently diagnosed with a psychotic disorder and are beginning to become more and more isolated?
Oh, yeah, this is such a wonderful topic, and again, something that we know, so I wish we knew more about, we know so little about. We do know that social connectedness changes during the lifespan for individuals with psychotic illnesses and individuals just in the community. And that it's such a critical period of the kind of the first episode period, but also just in the lives of young people. It's a very critical social period, late teens and early 20s. And we don't have the information to know about the effects of these interventions or these drugs across the lifespan. We just haven't collected enough data to know whether they act differently in young people than older people. I know there are some studies, there's a study being launched at UCLA that's kind of in the works, looking at the effects of MDMA on younger people in their late teens, which hasn't been done before. But those kinds of just safety studies would be very important to do as a next step, to look at these interventions in those populations, because it's in these clinical trials, in order to determine safety, we need to assess specific populations and make sure that the safety studies are inclusive of all different age ranges if we hope to use these medications in those populations. So the bottom line is we don't know. It is a critical social period. My hope is that these medications would be helpful to young people and older people, and that's something that hopefully we'll be able to disentangle in the coming years.
Well, Anya, I want to thank you again. And the fact that you're focusing on a topic that really has not received attention, but is so, so important. Thank you for that. And we'll want to have you back at some point down the road to hear what your findings are, because this is really such a key thing in the health of so many people. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to share this with you all.
Thank you. I'd like to ask people who are listening in today to consider making a donation to BBRF. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means if you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientist. To make a gift, please visit bbrfoundation.org or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you missed any portion or would like to share it with somebody, please visit the events and webinars page on our website. And I'd like to invite people to join us again next month on April 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Adriana Feder, Professor of Psychiatry at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, will present Developing a Potential New Treatment for Chronic PTSD, Ketamine Combined with Written Exposure Therapy. Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Once again, thank you so much.